Hey everybody, this been a long time. Hope everybody's doing well. We just finished up our Kill a Mockingbird. So now moving on to the William Shakespeare portion of our show. I'm gonna pop over to so you can see my handsome face real quick. So I don't know, didn't mean to scare you there. So we're going to be dealing with Shakespeare. I'm putting on some Elizabethan chamber music here to set the mood. And one of the big things about teaching Shakespeare is that in order to to really understand the plays, you have to understand the time period the play was set in. The play, trying to understand the play from the perspective of today's world, modern society, is a real big mistake, and people make that mistake all the time. When the plays get translated to movies, they mess that up. When teachers will try to teach this play and in other plays and use modern context, and it just doesn't work because the world was vastly different back in time of Shakespeare. In the Elizabethan era, the time period was different. And so the fact that when you're looking at something like these two teenagers making the decisions that they're making, and the parents making the decisions that they're making, and so on. We have to understand the religious views and the social views and all the things that were going on during that time. So the PowerPoint that we're going to go through is to get you relatively set. Just a brief understanding of what Romeo and Juliet, what the setting would have been, Shakespeare's time. So, this is, it's kind of like in my film class, my horror film club, I guess you'd say. We have a discussion of how the time period that horror movies really gives you a much better understanding of the horror films if you understand the time period. So, for instance, the movie The Thing came out in 1982. That's John Carpenter's The Thing, Kurt Russell. For those of you that don't know about it, it's men. They're in an Arctic station, and there's an alien that takes the form of other living creatures. At first, it takes the form of a dog, and then it starts to take the form of the people, and eventually, its goal is to eventually just to become and take the part of all the people on Earth. So the men at this Arctic station, can't allow it to get to main civilization, and so it's these men who they're not really sure who's the creature and who because it perfectly mimics their looks and so on, and eventually they decide to start figuring out who's who through the use of the blood test. So they take they draw blood and they test the blood, and you'd have to see the film. I don't want to spoil it because it's the first film I showed this year in my horror club. It's probably the greatest horror movie of all time, but I don't want to spoil too much. But anyway, that movie came out right at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic. So to understand it, yes, it's a great horror film, but to really get an understanding of it, to think that this movie, when it came out in 1982, that the people were, still didn't understand AIDS and were terrified of AIDS, and that film that very much would have resonated. You look at a lot of movies that came out in the early 70s, and they had a lot of stuff dealing with torture. And we were just still in the Vietnam era. We had the sexual revolution that was taking place in the 70s that is addressed in Halloween, movie like Halloween, where only the one girl who is virginal is the one that survives. So if you look at the films like that, a lot of films, you look at them in context, they make a lot more sense. And it doesn't mean that you can't enjoy the film for what it is without understanding those, but it does add a level of understanding to it. By the way, with this play, it is going to be the fact that I don't have to look at you in the face is going to make it a lot easier for me. But this play has a lot of this is a very It's a very dirty play. There's a lot of sexuality to it. Shakespeare's plays were filled with a lot of sexuality, a lot of real dirty jokes when we're talking about a bunch of teenage boys hanging out. So there's a lot of jokes about sex. There's a lot of dirty jokes. It's rather uncomfortable. So don't think that it's not uncomfortable for me. Usually when I'm in a class setting, it's much more uncomfortable when I have to talk about these things and I'm looking at you guys. So this is going to make it a little bit easier for me. So if you're, watching me talk about these things and well, you'll be seeing PowerPoints mostly. You won't be seeing my wonderful face. Just understand that I struggle with this as well. To teach it, I mean, it is what it is, and it is what Shakespeare intended, and it's the play. The school wants to teach the play, so we're going to learn the play. We're going to learn it the correct way. So I'm not going to hide things from you. But anyway, so I want to get to the PowerPoint, and we will get going here. I'm not going to do the whole thing today, or in this video. I'm going to cut it into pieces so you can watch it at different times, and so it doesn't become too overwhelming. So let's see. I got to share the screen. Pop that up there. And there we go. All right. So, so we've got, again, we understand a little bit about William Shakespeare's life. Understanding his life doesn't really help with the play. But, he is the most important writer in the history of humankind. So might want to, understand a little bit about him. So anyway, let's see. William Shakespeare's life. First off, he was born, gives you an idea of when these things would have been written. This is April 23rd, 1564 is when he was born, and he died, believe so, on April 23rd, 1616. There's not definitive proof that either of these things existed. All we have are his records here for his birth. We have records of his christening. We have his death record. But then, the idea that it's reported at a certain time and he could have died on the 22nd and then it was reported on the 23rd. But it's, the way that history judges it is like, hey, it's pretty cool that if we can put them all on the same day. So we're not 100% sure, but 90% sure that these are the right things. So, but anyway, it gives you an idea of, he lived to his early 50s, which was, pretty, that's a pretty good age. I'm 50 this year, so he only lived to be a couple years older than me, and I'm hoping that I got a lot more than a couple of years. But during this time period when there was rampant disease, and, you could die from, you fall over and break your leg, and that's probably going to end you because of diseases and things like sepsis and blood diseases and infection and all that, so that, you could die from a cold. So many things could kill you back in those days. So 50, living to what he lived is a, pretty good length of time, although the people did live to 70 and 80 years old. So it's not that everybody died young. But there were a lot of children that died, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that a little bit later. I got people texting me during this. And, so he was born in a town called Stratford upon Avon. It's it can be just referred to as Stratford. It's a town that's in England, and it's on the Avon River, which is why it's called Stratford upon Avon. So if we were to use the same sort of naming, it would be like Ceres upon the Tuolumne, right? Because the town itself is set, we're set on the Tuolumne River. So Stratford upon Avon in England, that's where he was born. His parents, John and Mary, very generic names. His father did pretty well for himself, ended up becoming mayor of Stratford. So that tells you that Shakespeare himself was, like kind of middle class. During that time would be considered middle class, meaning that also that he more than likely, since school costs money to go to school, he more than likely went to school and that's where he learned how to read and write. Shakespeare himself, in his later days, he married a woman named Anne Hathaway. He was 18 years old. She was 26. Now, even by today's standards, that's a little odd that that sort of an age disparity of 8 years, especially with the woman being 26 and him being 18 years old. Usually it was the other way around. Usually the man would be somewhere in his early mid-20s, because in order to get married, you'd have to, you should have a job, have an established, so that you could provide for a family. The woman didn't work. So, the man was the one that was providing everything. So usually You know, like I said, it was the other way around. What we do, so the idea of why they got married so early, and or why this happened, and why William Shakespeare at 18 years old would marry a 26-year-old, comes down to the birth of his first child, Susanna, who was born about 6 months after they got married. So that tells you that there was some, what would you say, sexual shenanigans going on between the two, some premarital stuff. Now, we're going to talk about this a lot later, and that the idea of premarital sex in the eyes, that is a very religious society. The idea of premarital sex, the church was highly looked down upon, But if, for instance, there was premarital sex and before they were married, the woman ended up pregnant, in the eyes of the church, as long as they got married, then that kind of squashed whatever issue the church had with it. So these two, more than likely, had been messing around, and Anne Hathaway had become pregnant, and so William Shakespeare was forced to marry Anne Hathaway, even though he was only 18 years old, and he didn't have a career. He did nothing. She was 26. And so, now he's got to put himself in a spot. And a couple of years later, they had, she gave birth to twins, Judith and a boy named Hamlet. Now, Shakespeare does have a play called Hamlet. And those of you that make it to my AP Lit class will talk quite a bit more about Shakespeare's son, Hamlet, who died as a child. And Shakespeare's play, Hamlet, has to deal with death and a lot of discussion about, family dying and so on. So anyway, there's more than likely some sort of a connection between those two things, but that's neither here nor there for this. But to understand, Shakespeare, when he's writing Romeo and Juliet, you do need to understand that Shakespeare himself had two daughters that eventually did get married, and two daughters. So when he was writing Romeo and Juliet, and he's writing about this character of Juliet, who's planning on getting married, and all of the situations that she has to deal with, you gotta understand that Shakespeare himself had two daughters in his house, so he understood very well the way that the world worked when it came to young girls. Other than this, in 1592, Shakespeare was in England because there was a play review that had his name in it. He went to England because he wanted to be a playwright. He wanted to be an actor, and he wanted to write plays. Well, you're not going to do that at Stratford. Like, for instance, if you wanted to be a movie actor, you wanted to, you're not going to do that as series. You're going to have to leave and go to Los Angeles. You're going to have to go or there's other places where you can go. There's like in Toronto. Toronto has a really good film industry now. You're going to have to go where films are being made. You're going to have to go where you're going to be able to make films. So if you were going to be a stage actor today, you would have to go to Los Angeles, or you would have to go to New York, Chicago. You have to go places where there's a large amount of people, and that's where you're going to be able to make enough money, especially now that he's got a wife and 3 children. He's got to be able to support his family. So Shakespeare leaves his family in Stratford, and he goes to England and becomes an actor. We know that because, again, in the play review, mentioned his name as an actor. And then we know that within the next year, he had started writing his plays that started being produced.
Disconnected.
Other than that, like I said, that's about all we know when it comes to William Shakespeare's life. All right, let's move on to the time of Shakespeare. So this is going to be called Elizabethan England. So when I'm referring to the Elizabethans, I'm talking about the people that lived during the time, the people that would have went to see Shakespeare's plays, the people, the life and so on of those people is what he was writing his plays. He was writing his plays for these people. Shakespeare wasn't writing his plays for teenage high school students to be tortured with. He wasn't thinking, I hope in, 400 or 500 years that there are going to be these teenagers sitting in a desk bored out of their minds, completely confused and irritated by these plays that I write. That wasn't what he was doing. What he was doing was he was trying to make money. He was trying to entertain a crowd full of people. So think of him more in terms of somebody like Steven Spielberg. Steven Spielberg is arguably in the last 40 years, probably the greatest director of the last 40 years when it comes to making popular films, when it comes to making what would be considered Hollywood films. You look at Shakespeare, Spielberg, you look at Jurassic Park, you look at Jaws, you look at Close Encounters, you look at E.T. But then at the same time, he makes entertaining films, but he also makes films that have, very serious point. You look at Saving Private Ryan, you can look at Schindler's List, you can look at Artificial Intelligence, Minority Report. He makes films that just kind of cover he makes romantic films. He made, the one thing that he was really bad at, he made a comedy one time. He's really terrible at it. But other adventure, Raiders of the Lost Ark, the guy is unmatched, unparalleled. So you think of Shakespeare in those terms. Shakespeare was simply trying to provide for the play going audience. He was trying to provide for them what they wanted. What they wanted was, to be entertained. What do you want to see in a movie? You want to see violence, of course. People love violence. Our movies are filled with violence. They wanted to see romance. They wanted to see comedy. They wanted to see, the sexual stuff, the salacious sexuality that, our TV is pervaded by that today. You all these reality shows and all of that, that sort of conflict and all of that stuff. Relatively the same sort of stuff that people want to see in movies and TV shows today is exactly what Shakespeare was providing. Again, just because he wanted to get people into the seats. So he wasn't trying to, like I said, he wasn't trying to write masterpieces. He just unintentionally did. He just unintentionally became the greatest writer in the history of human beings. But anyway, let's talk about the Elizabethan England. So first, again, Queen Elizabeth the first was queen until 1603. So we know that Shakespeare died in 1616. So in the middle of his career, Elizabeth, that's why they're called Elizabethans, was because of the importance of Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth was queen until 1603, and then King James I took over after her death. Now, King James was very attached to Shakespeare. Shakespeare actually ended up going to the castle and having his actors do private performances for King James and his court. King James absolutely loved playhouses, loved the actors. Some of you may recognize King James as the name of the version of the Bible, right? King James version of the Bible. So I want to show you something kind of cool. Let me see. All right. So one thing we've got to understand when it comes to dealing with Shakespeare and all of his plays is there's a very highly religious society. So religion is going to be something that's going to have to be talked about. And I'm not a religious person either way. I'm not a believer in anything. So I'm not pushing any sort of a religion, and I'm definitely not going to in any way try to disparage anybody's religion. So, there's no need for any sort of offense to be taken. And if there is offense to be taken, then it's not something that I'm doing, that I'm done intentional. But anyway, we're talking about Shakespeare and his closeness to King James. Now, King James decided that the Bible that existed at the time did not do glory enough to God. That God needed to be glorified, and not only just through people prayers and churches and so forth, but also through that the language of the Bible should be as beautiful as it possibly could be. So what King James did was he went out and he hired the best writers of the time. Now, we don't have a list of who those writers were. There's not like an author's list in the King James version of the Bible. So the writers themselves are unknown. The belief that Shakespeare may have been one of those writers. Now, this is something that's very interesting. When the King James version of the Bible was being written, it was during Shakespeare's. It would have been the 46th year of his life. Now, if we go from the top here, right? Well, let's start from the top. So we start with God is our refuge and strength, right? And you count 46 words starting here, correct? So you count 46, and I'm not going to count 46, but you go through and you count. If you want to do it, knock yourself out. and we get this here is the 46th word is the word shake. Right? Now you go down here to the bottom, you ignore the word salah because it's kind of like it's a word that kind of means that you like it's a break. It's not part of the psalm itself. You start with the word refuge, that's one, and then you move backwards. So 1, 2, 3, and you move back through. And what you will come to is that the 46th word is the word spear. And so you get 46 from the top, you get shake, you get 46 from the bottom, you get spear, 46 psalm. So, and it's the 46th psalm, it's 46 words, 46 words. It was written the 46th year of Shakespeare's life. Is that evidence that Shakespeare helped to write the King James Version of the Bible? We don't know. Again, we don't know. Some of the language that he wrote, it mirrors Shakespeare's patterns. But this is a pretty interesting case to be made here, wouldn't you think? Because some Nicolas Cage sort of stuff there. So anyway, back to our Elizabethan presentation. All right, so we'll talk about, again, this we'll deal with this a lot as the play goes along. Again, I just brought this up, the fact that the Elizabethans were highly religious. Now, they were Protestants. They had, with Elizabeth, they were Protestants. They had just come out of a society where they'd been Catholic because of Elizabeth's sister. And this, when you're talking about the conflict between Protestants and Catholics. Now, here's the way that you figure this out. If you are a Christian and you are not Catholic, then you are a Protestant. Protestants break into multiple different religions. Baptists and Lutherans and all kinds of different religions break down from Protestantism and Catholicism, Catholics. So it kind of splits itself into two. Very contentious during this time. The idea that if you were if you were a Protestant, if this was a Protestant society, which it was during Shakespeare's time, and you were a Catholic, then you would be arrested and put in prison. You could be tortured to death. They didn't want to put up with it. So, and if it was a Catholic society, the same thing went down. So when Mary was the queen before Elizabeth, and she was a Catholic, then yeah, things went down between those two religions. And you can find in societies today where that's still happening. Go to some places in like in Ireland and Scotland, and they're still having these conflicts between the Irish and the Catholics and the Protestants. Very ugly, violent conflict between them. We can look at the United States in the 1960s when John Kennedy was elected president, and America lost its mind thinking that because John Kennedy was the first Catholic president, thinking that that the United States was going to be suddenly under the control of the Pope, because that's the main guy. For if you're a Catholic, then the Pope is he's the head of the Catholic Church, and so people believed that Kennedy was going to be answering to the Pope, and that the Pope was actually going to be the real president, and so on. Which none of that happened, but it just shows you how scared people were, and how much those two religions in the past have had such conflict. But when we're talking about highly religious, we're talking about a large portion of the population being folks who, you went to church, you did not admit, if you were not a believer, you didn't say anything about it. And their belief system of believing the idea of heaven and hell, we, in our society, I'm not saying that people aren't, obviously we're still a very religious society, but we're not to that point where, how many times in your life have you told somebody, I swear to God, if you say that again, how many times have you said the phrase, I swear to God? Well, that's not something that you're supposed to do. And the idea of, if you look at the 10 Commandments and breaking the 10 Commandments is seen as a huge sin that damns your soul to hell. And think how many times you've lied, because that's one of the 10 Commandments. How many times have you, dishonored your parents? That's one of them. This idea of, if we're as religious as folks were in those times, they believed that if you made a promise and you broke it, if you swore to God and then you didn't follow through, that that you did go to hell, that there was a place where there was burning for eternity, and that's where you went. And so this idea of believing in and a firmness to the Bible. It's called orthodoxy. There's an orthodoxy to the Bible. The idea of killing people and punishing people for having broken these rules, these commandments and so on. People were much stricter when it came to religion in those days, and because of that, it's all through Shakespeare's plays, and also these were folks that were highly superstitious. They believed in things like ghosts and goblins and fairies and angels and demons and spirits and witches, especially with witches. Oh yeah, and even today, I mean, again, we're you know we can kind of go overboard at times as well with some of these things. And for a lot of you, I know that you're like, I don't believe in ghosts, but at the same time, if somebody were to take you, put you into a dark room somewhere and then lock you up and keep you in this room in the middle of the night, you get kind of weirded out. Well, what are people thinking about? Mostly thinking about ghosts. Look at the TV shows, Ghost Hunters and so on. And those are hugely popular shows. So this idea of ghosts is still something that, and witches. I mean, you still got this belief in folks that believe in witchcraft and people that practice witchcraft. You have the churches who are afraid of people being tainted. The Harry Potter books are some of the most banned books in the country because of the use of witchcraft. And churches are the ones that go after them and don't want those books in the schools because they're afraid that it's going to, turn children towards witchcraft or is going to damn their souls. Or so these ideas are not necessarily formed, but back in the Elizabethan era, they were, people were highly superstitious. And so that was definitely something that shows up in Shakespeare's plays. So when they see on stage ghosts, they know that the ghost on stage is fake. They understand that but they believe that those things existed in real life. And then on the another thing is there was overwhelming poverty. I mean, a huge portion of the population was incredibly poor. These were folks that were living day to day, couldn't afford doctors. These were folks that, they suffered. They had a real suffering in life. That's why they were so religious. The idea that, that they're going to be rewarded in the afterlife. They really believed that, and they wanted to believe that, because if your life sucked and there's nothing you can do about it, there was no school that you could go to and get an education and go on and make a better life for yourself. Shakespeare ended up becoming incredibly successful, but his father was the mayor. He was middle class. He was already kind of there already. And so, but if you were poor, for the most part, that's where you stayed. You did not get out of poverty then. There was no school to go to. There was no job that you could get to get yourself out of it. You just were, and to know that your whole life was going to be, live in poverty, man, that would be a drag. That would absolutely be a drag. So, religion helped. The idea that, okay, my life sucks right now and I'm poor, but this is what God wants. This is God's plan. And if I just accept it and live a good life, when I die, then I'm going to go to heaven and everything will be better. And then believing in superstition helps you believe that there are things other than this world, believing in things like witchcraft and believing in ghosts, especially with ghosts. I mean, if there are ghosts, that means there is an afterlife, right? And so the idea of the belief in those things help people in their poverty. One, it gave them something interesting to think about, but it also gave them a belief that there was an afterlife, and it made them feel better about the really awful lives that they lived at the time. All right, so I'm going to stop with that because I've kind of been rambling. It's a lot to talk about. I mean, if we were doing this during school day, this lecture took a week. There's a lot to talk about. But anyway, I hope this gives you a little bit of information to think about. Like I said, I'm going to stop. Let's stop sharing the screen. So my handsome face is going to pop up real quick. So don't get too scared. So like I said, it gives you some information, and I'll post another one here. Not asking you to necessarily do anything with this. I just want you to have this understanding of this information because it's going to make the play. You're really not going to understand the play correctly without knowing this information. So, all right. See you on the next one.